Have you ever noticed how your perspective on things often changes over time as your situation, your place in life shifts? Particularly as you grow older and perhaps come to see some of the wisdom of your elders that you dismissed in your youth. Mark Twain once made the following observation of his own life, particularly his journey from adolescence to adulthood, and he said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at just how much the old guy had learned in those 7 years." The commandment we are studying this morning is kind of like this: honor your father and your mother. When I first learned this as a boy, it seemed the most one-sided, unfair rule I ever heard. Right? Yet now that I'm a parent, I don't know, it has kind of a nice ring to it. The fifth commandment. With this, we begin the concluding series of 6 laws, all of which directly address our treatment of other people. Having laid the foundation of our relationship with God, we now turn to the issue of our relationship to others. As Jesus taught us, all the law can be summed up in 2 basic teachings. Love God with all that you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, of course, as soon as we even just begin to get into the whole issue of our interaction with others, problems arise. This is a commandment which traditionally causes a fair amount of confusion and grief. It is a commandment that creates a sort of unspoken tension. To begin with, as already hinted at, there is simply the imbalance of the law, that is, in the parent-child relationship. This commandment only makes a demand of the child. Nothing appears to be asked of the parent. And remember, when I use the word child, I don't necessarily mean a young person. I mean a person of any age in relation to their parents. No matter how old we are still our parents' children. And this commandment is addressed to children of all ages. So then within this commandment, there is this inherent imbalance. The onus being entirely on the child, while nothing seems to be required of the parent. And here's where the real problem kicks in. Namely, what happens when the parents are no good? Not everyone has the good fortune of growing up in a happy home. Many, in fact, sadly are raised in situations where one or both of their parents are downright evil. What do you do about that? This commandment demands from every child a certain relationship with their parents, seemingly regardless of the parent's behavior, and as if that wasn't bad enough, no explanations, no qualifications, no exemptions are put forward. What are we to make of this? Remember, even the best of parents can and commonly do make serious mistakes. As the old saying goes, if raising a family was easy, they wouldn't have called the start of it labor. It's tough. We all make mistakes, and we do ourselves a great disservice if we approach this commandment simply from the standpoint of applying it to some idealized, rosy fantasy image of parenting. So before we get down to what this commandment says, I believe we first need to just take a moment to consider what it does not say. As with all the commandments, what they don't say is as important as what they do, and we get ourselves into all sorts of trouble if we're not clear on this. Does this commandment say that a person must obey their parents? No. I realize this is the way this commandment is generally interpreted, the way all parents would like to apply it. Yet notice that God says nothing here about obedience. That is a whole other topic. Sorry about that, parents. Does this commandment say that a person must respect their parents? Once again, this is quite often the way this is understood and applied, and once again the answer is no. As we will see, the word honor here is not, despite our common usage, interchangeable with the notion of respect. And in point of fact, we already know this in our own experience. Respect is something that cannot be demanded, it can only be earned. In this manner, it is therefore possible to honor someone without respecting them. For instance, a person holding political office, it is possible to honor the authority of that office and yet fail to respect the person holding that office. But then that's a crazy illustration, because who ever heard of not respecting a politician? Right? But anyway, finally, does this commandment say that a person must love their parents? Once again, no. Quite frankly, due to a whole variety of circumstances, many people unfortunately grow up never loving one or both of their parents. And quite naturally, they feel incredibly guilty about this, like there's something deeply wrong with them. And if this wasn't bad enough, they read this commandment, then they also tend to imagine some pressure from God commanding them to love their parents. Yet note that this commandment never says that one must love their parents, or even like them. This is, of course, the greatest hope, yet once again, such things cannot be commanded. So then, this is what this commandment does not say. Well, what does it say to us? Well, there are three key things here I'd like to highlight. To begin with, This commandment, most obviously, in its broadest sense, proclaims the centrality, that is the prime importance, of family, not only within one's life in general, but most particularly within one's life with God. Note that this is the first subject God raises in turning to the complicated issue of our relationship to other people. And remember, all the 10 commandments are ultimately a means of expressing one's relationship with God. This fifth one, dealing with family, being no different. Now think about that. We all know that our families play a key role, arguably the key role, in the creation of who we are as individuals. It is within our families where we first learn our values, first practice social behavior, and so forth. We all know this. But we also generally recognize that how our families operate or fail to operate also creates much of who God is to us or who God is not to us. For example, let's say there's a person who grows up with a father who is absent, or who is always too busy with other more important things to give them any time, or who is just a child support check in the mail, or a child support check not in the mail, or who is downright abusive physically or emotionally. When this person comes to church and is taught to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," what do you think goes through their mind? You think they want to have anything to do with this God? Of course not. Now, this may be an extreme example, but it makes the point that we don't take the ordinary, everyday message we are sending one another, most particularly as a family, seriously enough. In this commandment, God is saying, first, family is crucial, folks. Out of this, everything grows or dies. How it operates creates much of one's relationship to God. And as we've seen over the past few weeks, the nature of one's relationship with God is what alone ultimately makes or breaks one's whole life. We have to pay close attention to this at all times. Thus, while, as noted, this commandment appears directed only at the children, we can thus see that truly the responsibility rests just as much, if not more, with the parents. This commandment does not exist in a vacuum. It's set within the framework of everyone being expected to keep all 10 commandments. Basically, for the parents who seek the obedience, respect, and love this commandment does not require, are they living the type of godly lives that produce such things? That is, the children are instructed by God to honor their parents, but the godly parent, knowing this, realizes that he or she must live honorably for God's sake. And this applies not only to the so-called religious stuff, like going to church and saying grace at mealtime, but almost even more to all the everyday, ordinary activities of family life. The parents who never let their children see them working through any differences, parents who themselves maybe never try to do the work of going through differences or only show moments of yelling and anger, they tend to create children fearful of conflict, thus weak in faith. They're afraid to ever really question or to doubt anything, fearful to ever disagree and to have differences. Conflict is bad and painful and anger-filled and destructive. The family where mistakes are constantly brought up and never forgotten tends to know a very unforgiving God. The homes where no achievement is ever quite good enough, where disappointment and criticism and correction are permitted to outweigh and overshadow praise and satisfaction and gratitude, tends to create an unloving, very judgmental God, a God for whom nothing is ever good enough. While conversely, the home where spills are laughed at more often than yelled at knows an understanding God. The family where at least one meal a day is shared together around a common table, not everyone always off on their own, knows a God who has time for you. The parents who, when their child asks for milk, occasionally brings them chocolate milk as a surprise, creates a God who is much better than expected. The incredible power, you see, of the everyday family stuff. As someone once said, the words spoken over the dinner table say far more about who God is than all the words spoken in prayer. Everything we do as families ultimately expresses our relationship with God. Are we paying close enough attention to this? Do we recognize that we may very well be continually making or breaking the lives around us every single day? The text first challenges us. In our families, are we helping or are we hindering one another on to God? Are we living the teachings of Christ in our homes, or is this sadly where we are the least Christian? How can we help those we love on to God today? Author Dick Innes writes, "When my boys were little, I would tuck them into bed every night, say their prayers with them, and speak positive affirmations to them. Affirmations such as, 'I am so proud of you,' and 'I'm so glad that God sent you to be part of our family,' and so forth. I used to whisper these affirmations in their ear when they were asleep. I don't know if it helped, but I knew it wouldn't hurt, and maybe, just maybe, it might record the message in their unconscious mind to help reinforce the fact that they were very much wanted and loved. When my youngest son, Mark, was about 9, I crept into his bedroom early one morning. I was certain he was asleep because he looked like an angel. I quietly leaned over and whispered in his ear, "O beloved of the Lord." As quick as a flash, he spun his head around, and in the darkness of the room, looking upward, he said without a moment's hesitation, "Is that you, God?" When I regained my composure, I whispered back in his ear, "No, it's not God, but God sent me to tell you that." And in that moment, I realized just how often, for him, my voice is speaking for God and the sacred trust that truly is. This commandment first reminds us of the centrality of family in all of our relationships with God. From this end, this commandment then secondly tells us that our families, by their very design, are going to have problems. That is, it points us toward the struggle of family. This, of course, is the whole premise of this commandment. That within all families, there are troubles, there are tensions, most notably between the generations, right? Differences and separations between parents and children, each, sort of chafing at each other. If such problems were not common, not normal and natural to all families, then God wouldn't have had to provide a commandment regarding it. But God did, and in this we can find a great deal of comfort and instruction. First of all, it should comfort us by letting us know that if we are having some sort of problem in our family, that there's nothing abnormal about that, and we can be assured that God is aware of such things, understands them, even expects them, and is acting to address them. Secondly, that even more, this should then instruct us by hinting that perhaps if we can try to be even just a little bit more aware and understanding and expecting of such problems as God is, we can also then be able to address them properly in the same fashion that God does. My father once taught me a great lesson on exactly this, without his even knowing it. And what happened was this: as hard as it is to believe, and I know I've asked some really outrageous things of you in the past, but this is probably the craziest. As hard as it is to believe, when I was younger, particularly when I was a teenager, I had long, thick, flowing blonde hair. Well, at one point my hair was very long, all the way down to my shoulders. And now my father was not too pleased with this, but I'll never forget what he told me one day. He said, "Son, I really don't like your hair that long. But I remembered that when I was your age, I always wanted to have hair longer than your grandfather would allow me to have. So go ahead and grow whatever length you like." Little did I know at the time that he would eventually have the last laugh, for I now wear my hair exactly as he does. But you see, my father handled the situation perfectly because he remembered. That is, he was aware of and understanding of and expecting of family tension. He didn't have some fantasy, Brady Bunch image of family, as so many people do, where everyone always agrees and no problem. No, he knew that tension and difference defines family just as much as peace and happiness does. And what he ultimately knew was that how he handled this was the key. He took a tension between us and turned it into a moment that made us closer, How? By knowing what isn't worth fighting over, by remembering his own experiences, by letting me be myself, and most importantly, by giving of himself to the relationship and not just demanding from it. The second theme of this commandment, basically, is that a perfect family is an oxymoron. There is no such thing. There's always going to be tension, differences and disagreements, failures and injuries. The issue is not if such things will arise, but only how we handle them when they do, Do we just insist on our own way, demand only of the other person, in effect become an island unto ourselves? Or as the core of this commandment demands, to be in relationship with others when there is tension? Most especially, not demand of the other person, but instead give of ourselves to them. Basically, the second challenge in this commandment is this. What tension is there presently within your family, and what are you doing about it? Not what are you demanding somebody else do about it, but what are you doing about it? What are you giving to the relationship? One author writes, "There once was a father who became quite disturbed about the length of time his 6-year-old son was taking to get home from school. The father decided he would make the trip to discover for himself how long it should take a small boy to cover the distance. The father walked it and settled on 20 minutes, but his son was still taking it an hour to walk home. Finally, the father decided to secretly follow his son home one day to see what was taking just so long. After the trip, the man said, 'The 20 minutes I thought reasonable was right, but I failed to consider such important things as a side trip to track down a trail of ants, or an educational stop to watch construction workers fix the street. or the time it took to swing around a half a dozen telephone poles, or just how much time it took for a boy to get acquainted with 2 stray dogs and a brown cat. In short, said the father, I had forgotten what it's really like to be 6 years old. I let him take some extra time now. Centrality of family, the struggle of family, all of which brings us third and finally to what about this whole honor thing? Well, as noted earlier, the word honor here does not mean obey or respect or love. It is in fact derived from a root word meaning to make heavy. In other words, in this context, to say that you honor someone is literally to give weight to them. The reverse of this obviously being literally to take lightly. In other words, what this commandment is telling us is not to take our parents lightly, to instead give weight to them. But what does this mean? Does it mean we're just supposed to feed our parents and take them out to dinner? You know? Nice idea, hint, hint. But actually it means 2 things. First of all, it is an instruction to remember the basic value, first of our parents, and then through them of all other people, and how life can fall apart when we forget this. Understand, in ancient times, weight was equated with worth. In contrast to our modern, you can never be too thin culture. In ancient cultures, heaviness was a sign of prosperity. It was a good thing. If you had enough food to be heavy, you were doing well. Weight was value. A remnant of this type of thinking being today, for example, currency based upon the weight of gold. Using this understanding of honor, many scholars contend that what God is really attempting to counter here is the all too common devaluation of parents by their children, particularly as those parents grow older and move from productivity to needing to be provided for. That is, the danger is that each generation will discard its predecessors the instant those predecessors are deemed no longer useful by them, a burden. Something that we need only look to our modern society to discover is rampant, in families and youth-oriented culture. Yet let us not forget the promise that is also added on to this commandment. It says, honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, what is the reverse of this? Well, it's by inference. Fail to do this and your days will be short. Why? Because when we toss aside the generation that came before us, effectively we throw away all that they have to offer us, we lose out, and in this essentially we set up the pattern where we are next. Right? That is, those who live by the sword shall perish by the sword. When we devalue others, we effectively devalue ourselves. But when we value them, we value us. Think of it this way. Have you ever heard the old story? It was told by the Brothers Grimm of the old man and the bowl. It goes like this. There once was a little old man of trembling hands and feeble eyes, whose uncertain table habits became increasingly offensive to the daughter-in-law with whom he lived, until one day she objected vigorously to her husband, the old man's son. She and her husband took the fumbling old man to a corner of the kitchen, set him on a stool, and gave him his food in an earthenware bowl. Now he was no longer troubling them by his dribbling food. Now the tablecloth was no longer soiled by his trembling behavior. One day in his trembling, he dropped the bowl and broke it. Now his son and daughter-in-law ceased even their moderate civility. If you are a pig, they said, you must eat from a trough. And they made a little wooden trough, and the old man was forced to kneel down in the corner of the kitchen and to eat from it. The pride and joy of this couple's life was their 4-year-old son. One evening, they noticed the boy playing with blocks in the very serious fashion that children often invest in their play. The parents asked him, "What are you making, son? A house? A castle? A fort?" "No," the young boy replied with a happy smile. "I'm making a trough for you two to eat out of when I'm old enough." It is most telling that in saying only one thing here directly about family, God chooses a word that emphasizes not losing sight of the value of our family members to us. For it is exactly around this that most families ultimately fall apart. More than injuries and failings, it's when we lose sight of the value of one another. We let ourselves forget it, mistreat it. We allow other things to take greater value to us. Are you truly valuing your loved ones? Value one another is the heart of family. It's more than love. It carries you over love, When we devalue the generation that came before us, the whole thing collapses. We lose the gift of what they offered. We devalue ourselves, and this leads us then into the second way that honor is used, as is to give way to, can be taken, which is as to take seriously. That is the reverse of to take lightly. In effect, the final punchline of all of this is that this commandment can finally be simply taken as a word of sage advice from a God who has seen it all, effectively saying, folks, if you want your life to be good, take your parents, their lives seriously. Listen to what they say. Study closely what they do and don't do, what they did and didn't do. All the lessons you need in order to have a great life are right there. Now this means, first of all, obviously trying to do what our parents did right. It's amazing how often we miss this. It's like the old saying, many people are so busy trying to give their children what they never had, they forget to give them what they did. But also, just as importantly, it means that we need to learn from our parents' mistakes and not repeat them. Once again, it's amazing how often we miss this. Haven't you ever had those moments as an adult where you suddenly find yourself doing something exactly like your parents did, something you said you would never do, Those moments when you suddenly go, oh no, I've turned into my mother or my father or whatever. The person who makes an effort to repeat the good their parents did rightly honors their mother and father. They take the impact of those lives seriously. But the person who allows themselves to repeat the evil their parents did, or who just takes the cop-out of their failings, saying, it's the way I was raised, it's all I know, they dishonor their parents by not learning from them and moving beyond them. They're not taking them seriously enough. In all this, we finally see why God ultimately focused all the attention solely upon the relationship with our parents. Because this is the foundation of everything else. This is what unites all of us here. We may not all be parents, but we are all always children. What our parents give to us, good or bad, and what we choose to make of it, good or bad, creates our world. The first thing one learns in this life is how to be the child of a parent, and from that everything else grows. What are we making of what we've learned? In closing, ask yourself two questions. What is the best thing about my parents? And am I living that, offering it to my family and to the world? And then, secondly, what would I change about my parents? And am I making that change and offering it to my family and to the world? It all begins with that initial child-to-parent relationship and what we choose to make of it throughout our lives. The makings of a great life is there if we will only honor it. One author writes, we come by business naturally in our family. Each of the 7 children in our family worked in our father's store in Mott, North Dakota, a small town on the prairies. We started working by doing odd jobs like dusting, arranging shelves, and wrapping, and later graduated to serving customers. As we worked and watched, we learned that work was about more than survival and making a sale. One lesson stands out in my mind. It was shortly before Christmas. I was in the 8th grade and was working evenings straightening the toys section. A little boy, 5 or 6 years old, came in. He was wearing a brown, tattered coat with dirty, worn cuffs. His hair was straggly except for a cowl that stood straight up from the crown of his head. His shoes were scuffed and one shoelace was torn. The little boy looked very poor to me, too poor to afford to buy anything. He looked around the toy section, picked up this item and that, and carefully put them back in his place. Dad came down the stairs and walked over to the boy. My dad's steel blue eyes smiled and the dimple in his cheek stood out as he asked the boy what he could do for him. The boy said that he was looking for a Christmas present to buy for his brother. I was impressed that my dad treated him with the same respect as any adult. Dad told him to take his time and to look around, which he did. After about 20 minutes, the little boy carefully picked up a toy plane, walked up to my dad and said, "How much for this, mister?" "How much you got?" Dad asked. The little boy held out his hand and opened it. His hand was creased with wet lines of dirt from clutching the money. In his hand lay 2 dimes, a nickel, and 2 pennies, 27 cents. The price of the toy plane he picked out was $3.98. "Well, that'll just about do it," Dad said as he closed the sale. Dad's reply still rings in my ears. I thought about what I'd seen as I grabbed the present. When the little boy walked out of the store, I didn't notice the dirty, worn coat, the straggly hair, or the single torn shoelace. What I saw was a radiant child with a treasure, and my father had made it happen. As my father walked past me to get back to work, noticing that I had been observing all this, he said to me quietly, "Remember, son, there is more to life than making a living." And today I run the store and have made it my goal to live my father's lesson, and it has repeatedly blessed me to not just make a living, but to live. Thank you, Dad. A philosopher once said, "Many things may change us, many influences may affect us, but in the final analysis, we begin and we end with family." The 5th commandment God addressing the crucial issue of the proper human relationship, beginning with the fundamental relationship, family, parent and child. Family is central. Family is a struggle. Value your parents and live the lessons they taught you. A great life is right there. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 445, Happy the Home When God is There. Would you please stand?